Her name was Eleanor Grace, though most people just called her Grandma Ellie. The lines on her face weren't just wrinkles, they were timelines, carved by laughter, sorrow, and countless nights of silent endurance. She came to America with a heart full of hope and pockets almost empty. A single suitcase, a faded photograph of her parents, and a dream so fragile that even the cold winds of New York seemed to whisper doubt into it. Yet, with every struggle, Eleanor held on, because deep inside she believed she wasn't meant to live a small life. She was meant to build one. Because some journeys don't begin with courage, they create it along the way. The early years in America were brutal. Eleanor worked at a small diner in downtown Brooklyn, scrubbing dishes until her hands cracked from the cold water. Every night, she would walk home through empty streets, clutching her coat tighter, whispering to herself, "Just a little longer, Ellie, you're going to make it." She lived in a tiny apartment, the kind where the walls were thin and dreams even thinner. But in that solitude, she discovered strength. She learned to smile at strangers, to laugh at her own mistakes, and to fight against the loneliness that often felt like a second skin. Because even in the darkest corners of struggle, hope finds a way to glow. Years passed, and Eleanor slowly started piecing her life together. She learned English by reading street signs, old newspapers, and overhearing conversations at the diner. Every paycheck, no matter how small, brought her closer to something she could call stability. But even as she began to build her new life, she often sat by her window late at night, thinking of home. Her mother's voice, her father's laughter, and the village that once smelled like rain and jasmine. There were nights when she'd whisper into the dark, "Did I do the right thing, leaving everything behind?" Have you ever chased a dream so far that you started losing pieces of yourself along the way? One rainy evening, Eleanor met David, a kind-hearted mechanic who had the same tired eyes as hers, eyes that carried both pain and purpose. He would often come to the diner after work, ordering the cheapest meal just to sit and talk to her. Their conversations began with small talk and slowly turned into shared dreams. Within a year, they got married in a small courthouse with no family, no fancy dress, just two souls promising to hold each other through the storm. Together, they built a humble life, working long hours and saving every penny. When their first child, Lily, was born, Eleanor held her close and whispered, "You'll never have to struggle the way I did." Because sometimes love doesn't come to rescue us, it comes to remind us what we're fighting for. Life began to bloom again for Eleanor. The small apartment that once echoed with silence was now filled with the laughter of a baby and the smell of fresh bread. She worked days at the diner and spent nights sewing clothes for extra money while David fixed cars in their driveway until midnight. They were poor, painfully poor, but every smile from Lily made it all worth it. Still, there were moments when Eleanor would wake up before dawn, sit by the window with a cup of cheap coffee, and wonder how long she could keep pushing through exhaustion. "This is for her," she'd whisper to herself. "Every blister, every tear, it's all for her." As the years went by, Eleanor and David finally managed to move into a modest little house, their first real home. It wasn't much, but to Eleanor, it felt like a castle built on hope. She decorated it with second-hand furniture and handmade curtains, proudly turning every corner into a memory. On weekends, she and David would sit on the porch, watching Lily play in the front yard, her laughter blending with the sound of rustling leaves. For a moment, life felt perfect, fragile but perfect. Yet deep in Eleanor's heart, she always carried a quiet fear that happiness never stays for long. Because when life finally gives you peace, a part of you still waits for the storm. But peace, as Eleanor feared, didn't last long. One cold winter evening, David came home late, his hands trembling, his face pale. He'd been laid off from the factory due to budget cuts. Just like that, their fragile stability shattered. Bills began to pile up, food became simpler, and laughter grew quieter in the house. Eleanor took up extra cleaning jobs, scrubbing offices late into the night while David searched desperately for work. Yet, through all the hardship, she never complained. She simply whispered to herself, "We've survived worse. We'll survive this too." But sometimes, even the strongest hearts ache in silence. Because no one talks about how heavy, quiet sacrifices can be until they break you from within. Years passed, and life kept testing her resilience. David finally found another job, but it took him miles away from home. Eleanor would stand at the doorstep every morning, waving goodbye with a smile. And then, the moment he disappeared from sight, tears would quietly roll down her cheeks. Nights were long, and loneliness became her silent companion. She filled the silence with the ticking of a wall clock and the hum of an old radio. Sometimes she'd whisper to herself, "This is what love is, waiting, even when it hurts." Because love isn't always about being together. Sometimes it's about holding on when everything pulls you apart. One day, Eleanor received a call, the kind that changes everything. David had met with an accident at work. The world around her went silent as she dropped the phone, her trembling hands clutching her heart. Hours later, at the hospital, she saw him lying unconscious, machines breathing for him. She held his hand and whispered, "You promised me forever, not this silence." Days turned into weeks, and though David eventually opened his eyes, he was never the same. His laughter faded, his spirit dimmed, and Eleanor's strength had to shine brighter than ever before. Sometimes love doesn't break, it bends, carrying the weight of two hearts instead of one. After the accident, Eleanor became more than a wife. She became a caretaker, a silent warrior who fought battles no one saw. She would wake up before dawn, help David sit up, make his meals, and then head to her part-time job, pretending everything was fine. There were nights she would quietly cry in the kitchen while washing dishes, the sound of running water hiding her tears. And yet, every morning she smiled for him, because love meant staying even when life stopped moving. But one night, when David looked at her and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me," her heart broke and healed at the same time. She realized she wasn't surviving anymore, she was living for love. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even pain felt like a promise worth keeping? As the years passed, David's health continued to decline, and Eleanor's hair turned from chestnut brown to silver strands of quiet strength. The house that once echoed with laughter now hummed with the soft beeps of medical machines. Yet she never let sorrow take over the walls. She would play their favorite old songs, humming along while holding his frail hand. Sometimes she would talk to him about the days when they danced barefoot in the kitchen, pretending he could still remember. One rainy evening, she looked out the window and whispered, "We promised forever, but forever feels too short now." The loneliness in her voice could have shattered the sky, yet she smiled through her tears, because her love was never meant to fade, even if he did. Can a heart keep beating for someone who's already half gone? The day David passed away, the world fell utterly still for Eleanor. The ticking clock on the wall sounded like thunder in her ears, counting the seconds without him. She sat beside him, her wrinkled fingers tracing the lines of his palm one last time, the same hand that had once built their dreams. She whispered softly, "Rest now, my love. I'll carry our memories where you can't." As they took him away, she didn't cry immediately. Grief settled slowly, like winter frost on her heart. That night she made 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for him, and stared at the empty chair until dawn. When the person you lived for becomes a memory, even breathing starts to feel like breaking. After David's passing, the house became a museum of moments, untouched mugs, his old jacket on the chair, the faint scent of his cologne that lingered like a ghost of comfort. Eleanor tried to fill the silence with routine, watering plants, knitting sweaters no one asked for, watching old black and white movies. But loneliness has a way of whispering when the world goes quiet. Sometimes she'd catch herself talking to the empty space beside her. asking what he'd think about the world now, if he'd still laugh at her burnt cookies, if he'd still call her Ellie like he used to. Late at night, when the moonlight fell across the empty side of the bed, she'd sigh softly and say, "Good night, my love. I hope you're still dreaming with me." Have you ever loved someone so much that even silence starts to sound like their name? Years passed, but grief doesn't follow a calendar. It lingers in corners, in half-folded blankets, in memories that refuse to fade. Eleanor found herself visiting the park more often, sitting on the same bench where she and David once shared coffee and laughter. Now, she watched young couples walk by, holding hands, stealing glances, laughing freely. It reminded her of the fire that once lived in her own heart, a warmth she missed deeply but cherished even more. Sometimes, a child's laughter would make her smile, and other times, it would break her all over again. But no matter how hard the days got, she promised herself to keep moving. "Because that's what he'd want," she'd whisper. And somehow, that promise became her anchor in the storms of loneliness. When love becomes memory, does the heart ever truly heal, or just learn to live with the ache? Eleanor decided to volunteer at the local community center, teaching young immigrants how to cook simple American meals, the same ones she had once struggled to learn herself decades ago. In their eyes, she saw her younger self, frightened, hopeful, determined. She became their Grandma Ellie, the woman who always brought cookies and stories that smelled like nostalgia. Every laugh they shared, every recipe she taught, felt like stitching together the pieces of her own broken heart. But deep down, she knew she wasn't just teaching them how to live in America. She was teaching herself how to belong again. Sometimes healing doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from giving others the love you once lost. One winter evening, while Eleanor was closing up the community center, she noticed a young girl sitting alone outside, crying softly, her phone clutched in trembling hands. The girl, named Sophia, had recently moved to the US and missed her family back home. Eleanor sat beside her, offering a warm cup of tea from her thermos. She listened, really listened, the way only someone who's known deep pain can. Sophia reminded her of herself when she was young, frightened but full of quiet strength. Eleanor wrapped her shawl around Sophia's shoulders and whispered, "You'll be okay, my dear." Sometimes the world feels too big, but your heart will learn to grow into it. Isn't it strange how the people we help often end up saving us too? Days turned into weeks, and Sophia began visiting Eleanor regularly, bringing her groceries, helping her with chores, sometimes just sitting beside her as they watched old movies together. For Eleanor, Sophia became a ray of light in her quiet, aging world. And for Sophia, Eleanor became the family she'd left behind. They cooked, laughed, and even cried together, finding comfort in the bond that needed no words, no blood relation, just love. One afternoon, as they were baking cookies, Eleanor looked at Sophia with teary eyes and said softly, "You know, sometimes God takes away people we love only to send others who remind us why love is still worth giving." Have you ever met someone who walked into your life when you needed them the most and made you believe in love again? As time passed, Eleanor's health began to fade. Her hands trembled when she tried to hold her knitting needles, and her once strong voice now carried the softness of distant winds. Yet she never complained. Instead, she'd sit by the window each morning, sipping her tea, whispering gratitude for another sunrise. Sophia would visit every day after work, bringing flowers, stories, and laughter that filled the house with life again. One evening, when Sophia asked if she was scared of getting older, Eleanor smiled faintly and replied, "No, my dear, age doesn't scare me. What scares me is leaving behind people who still need love. Because sometimes the deepest fear isn't of dying, it's of being forgotten by the ones we once lived for." One chilly November night, Sophia arrived with a homemade pie and found Eleanor sitting quietly on her rocking chair, gazing at an old photo album. The pictures told a story. of youth, of love, of sacrifices that shaped generations. Tears rolled down Eleanor's wrinkled cheeks as she softly ran her fingers over a photo of David, whispering, "We did it, didn't we? We made a life out of nothing." Sophia knelt beside her, holding her fragile hands, feeling the warmth of decades fade beneath her touch. Eleanor looked at her and said, "Promise me, Sophia, when I'm gone, don't let the world make your heart cold. Keep giving even when it hurts." When love becomes your final lesson, do you think the heart ever stops teaching? A few weeks later, the first snow of the season fell, soft, silent, and endless. Sophia arrived that morning to find Eleanor's home unusually still. The teacup by the window was untouched, and the blanket rested neatly on the chair. Eleanor had passed peacefully in her sleep, her favorite photograph of David held gently in her hands. There was no note, no farewell, just an open window, as if her soul had quietly drifted away with the dawn. Sophia wept, not just for the loss, but for the love that had filled every corner of that small house. At the funeral, Sophia placed a single sunflower on Eleanor's casket and whispered, "You'll never be forgotten, not as long as I'm alive." And as the wind carried the scent of flowers through the air, it almost felt like a soft voice whispered back, "Thank you for listening." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because every heart that remembers keeps love alive forever.